In the early hours of the morning, Fletcher Christian stood awake at the helm of HMAV Bounty. His stomach probably grumbled from the measly half portion of rations he had eaten many hours before, and although his mind should have been on commanding the vessel, the constant berating and belittling he had received month after month by his commanding lieutenant and so-called friend, William Bligh, filled his mind. He couldn't live another day under such a tyrant, and so had but two choices: use the wood he had acquired from the vessel's carpenter, Purcell, to build a makeshift raft and float to Tofua, to be potentially beaten to death on the shoreline by the native islanders, or silently collect the vessel's weaponry, corral those loyal to Bligh, and take command of the Bounty for himself. With that, he abandoned the vessel's wheel, headed below deck, and began an incident that would forever be etched in the annals of maritime history: the Mutiny of the Bounty. Christian located Quintel and Martin, two able seamen that had his allegiance, and after finding the names of more potential mutineers, they made their way to the upper deck, ordering anyone there to silence while taking control over it. Christian then went below again, collecting muskets from the chest they were stored, and distributed them between the mutineers before making their way to Bligh's cabin. Christian and Churchill quickly grabbed Bligh and tied his hands behind his back, telling him they would kill him if he called for help. Bligh swiftly called as loudly as I could in hopes of assistance. This woke up Fryer, whose cabin was only just across from Bligh's, and when he saw the mutineers dragging Bligh to the quarterdeck, he was told to lay down and hold my tongue or I was a dead man. Fryer made his way to the quarterdeck and briefly managed to talk with Bligh before being forced back below by Fletcher, who stated, "I have been in hell for weeks past. Captain Bligh has brought this on himself." The quarterdeck swiftly became unorganised chaos as shouting, jeering and cursing caused more crew to investigate the noise. The mutineers would berate Bligh as he continued to shout for them to knock Christian down. During this time, Christian was visibly distressed, apparently openly weeping, armed with a bayonet, with a heavy sounding plummet around his neck, so in the event of the mutiny failing, he could throw himself overboard and swiftly be dragged to the bottom. Christian originally ordered for the jolly boat, the smallest of the craft on Bounty, to be set to sea, but upon realising the amount of Loyalists, over half the crew, the 23-foot launch was lowered into the water. Of the supplies given to the Loyalists were rations enough for 5 days for the 19 crew, basic survival equipment, carpentry tools, and 4 cutlasses. The craft was double its capacity, being just a few inches above the waterline as men and provisions were lowered in one by one. Finally, Bligh was cut loose, and as he was manhandled towards the deck's edge, asked Christian if this treatment was proper considering the many instances of friendship he had received from Bligh. Christian, with much emotion, replied, That, Captain Bligh, that is the thing. I am in hell. I am in hell. Some Loyalists, including the 2 carpenter's mates, the armourer and a midshipman, were kept aboard Bounty, as Christian deemed them essential to the functional sailing of the vessel. They implored Bligh to give testament to their innocence in the mutiny, which Bligh responded with, "Never fear, lads, I'll do you justice if I ever reach England." At around 10 o'clock in the morning, the rope to the launch was cut, and the 2 parties disappeared away from one another. The Loyalists northeast to Tofua, and the mutineers aboard the Bounty heading northwest, as cries of "Huzzah for old Tahiti!" echoed across the water from the ship. Bligh firstly planned to collect supplies on Tofua for the 3,500 nautical mile trip back to civilization in Kupang, East Timor. They anchored the launch in a cave to the northwest of Tofua's coast and began collecting water and other necessary supplies. The indigenous were at first friendly, but over the course of 4 days became more and more threatening. On the 2nd of May, the islanders gathered on a beach, demanding Bligh hand over the magnifying glass they had witnessed him use to start a fire earlier. Upon Bligh's refusal, the Tofuans began clacking rocks together, a sign Bligh knew from his time with Cook that violence was shortly to follow. The men were hurried into the launch and started to make way when the Tofuans grabbed the boat's stern rope and began dragging it back to shore. The quartermaster, John Norton, leapt out of the boat, cutlass in hand, in an attempt to scare the Tofuans away, but was swiftly overwhelmed by the crowd and beaten to death. This distraction gave Bligh an opportunity to cut the stern rope, allowing the boat to escape and probably saving the lives of all aboard. During this time, Christian and the mutineers went about making the bounty their own. They swiftly divvied up the possessions the Loyalists had left behind and threw the breadfruit crop into the sea. Christian knew that, regardless of Bligh surviving the ordeal, a search party would be sent for the bounty if it didn't arrive in the West Indies, and so, instead of sailing straight to Tahiti as Bligh assumed, they would travel to the small island of Tubai, 450 nautical miles south of Tahiti. As Bligh and his Loyalists made way westward, storms and swells nearly engulfed the small boat, forcing them to constantly bail bucket loads of water into the sea. As they crested waves, the wind would nearly capsize them, and in the troughs water would gush in from the stern. Bligh knew that morale would be desperately low, and so got the crew to recite songs, pray together, and often told stories of his previous voyages. Strangely enough, now Bligh had been stripped of the bounty, he approached his leadership with a new compassion. The launch had made its way over 100 miles from where they were originally cast adrift, to the Fiji Islands, but having heard rumours that the islanders were cannibals, they decided to sail straight past them. The men implored Bligh to take the launch to shore in search for provisions, but Bligh denied the request. On the 10th of May, Bligh commanded the men to create a weather cloth. By cannibalising some spare sails, Purcell the carpenter was able to make a skirt that surrounded the top of the boat, raising the freeboard of the tiny vessel and aiding it in surviving the deep swells. The encounter in Tofua had made the party re-evaluate their initial plan of island hopping and gathering supplies as they went. There was no guarantee that any other indigenous islanders would treat them with civility, so Bligh decided to cut the rations to a meagre portion, an ounce of bread and a quarter pint of water for each man a day. Enough to last them to East Timor. This plan was unanimously agreed by all aboard. The weather at this time didn't improve, with Bligh writing on the 17th of May that our situation was miserable, always wet and suffering extreme cold without the least shelter from the weather. On the 24th of May, Bligh realised he had 29 days of rations left, now the coconut and breadfruit was gone. He knew that a change in the weather may lengthen their voyage, so sought to extend their supplies by a further 6 weeks. This was accomplished, with the crew's consent, by limiting meals to only twice a day. By sheer lucky coincidence, they managed to capture a seabird the next day, and again another the next morning, which was diced up and eaten raw. They then later caught 2 more on the 27th of May. While all this was occurring, on the 28th of May, the Bounty and the Mutineers arrived in Tubai and was swiftly attacked by a flotilla of indigenous war canoes. Christian fired cannons at the approaching warriors, apparently killing at least a dozen and forcing the rest to scatter. After navigating a reef that surrounded the island, they landed ashore and decided it would be a suitable location for a permanent settlement. The issue they now faced was finding a compliant enough labour force to create such a colony. With this, they headed back to Tahiti. After a week of sailing the small boat, birds were seen circling overhead and the weather had cleared, a sign land was near. On the 28th of May, Bligh navigated the launch into the safe waters of the Great Barrier Reef, off the northeast coast of Australia. The boat was then ran ashore on a small piece of land Bligh would name Restoration Island. Here the men fed themselves with the plentiful supply of oysters and berries they found, whilst restocking their provisions. As elevating as the plentiful crop was, the gorging swiftly made the crew ill, with stomach pains and diarrhoea. Whilst overhauling the boat there, they discovered the rudder had taken substantial damage from the turbulent stern currents. By sheer luck the rudder hadn't broke, but if it had, the boat would have been surely swamped by the churning sea before a stern oar could be affixed. After 2 days' rest they once again made way, beginning to island hop on the inside of the lagoon, when they noticed they were being watched by aboriginals from the mainland. This is when the second mutiny in a month nearly occurred for Bligh. A heated argument started between him and the carpenter Purcell, a similar incident that had occurred once before on Tasmania. This time though, the disagreement elevated to physical threats, as Bligh grabbed a cutlass, threw one to Purcell and challenged him to a fight. The tension elevated even more so when Fryer commanded for Bligh to be arrested, which Bligh responded by saying he would kill Fryer if he intervened. The Bounty's mutinous crew arrived back at Tahiti on the 6th of June. This is when Christian married his partner, Marturua, or Isabella, who he had spent many months with whilst waiting for the breadfruit crop to cultivate. Whilst procuring workers and supplies, Christian concocted a lie, saying that he, Bligh, and Cook had founded a settlement on Aitutaki in the Cook Islands, despite Cook being dead for over a decade at this point. This lie was more than likely concocted to ensure a peaceful relationship between Christian and Pomer, implying that civilization and reinforcements were not too far away if needed. On the 16th of June, the Bounty began its voyage back to Tobai, with nearly 30 additional Tahitian men and women aboard. On the 2nd of June, the launch that carried Bligh and the Loyalists rounded Cape York, the most northerly point of Australia. Bligh hugged the coast, sticking close to the shoals and reefs of the Prince of Wales Channel near the Endeavour Strait. After they stuck to the coast for as long as they could, they eventually sailed out northwestward again into the Arafura Sea. Over the next 2 weeks they battled the rough seas, starvation and melancholy, with their salvation, Kupang Harbour, still over 1,000 nautical miles away, as they once again entered the open ocean. The trade winds were blowing from a west-southwest direction, perfect for a direct route to Kupang, despite the constant need for bailing by the crew. Considering the favourable wind and the men's exhaustion, on the 6th of June Bligh decided to reintroduce the third meal of the day. 2 days later, they managed to capture a small dolphin, which was swiftly divvied up. Despite this, Bligh began to notice signs of scurvy among the men. Weeks of starvation was beginning to slowly catch up to them, despite them being so close to rescue. Deep in the night of the 12th of June, "Land ho!" was shouted as the glinting lights of Timor were observed in front of them. Bligh, ever cautious after losing Norton, decided to stay at sea while searching for Kupang Harbour, as if they were to land, considering their starvation, they could be easily overwhelmed by the locals. The next couple of days consisted of them steadily making their way around the coast to salvation. Eventually, on the 14th of June they sailed into the harbour and had finally rescued themselves from unimaginable peril with a makeshift Union Jack tied to the top of the mast. Upon arrival in Kupang, their struggle was frustratingly far from over. Despite them being overwhelmingly cared for by the locals, many of the Loyalist crew, including Bligh, fell ill, most probably from malaria and consequences from the ordeal they had just faced. The master's mate Elphinstone, the quartermaster Linkletter, the butcher Robert Lamb, and the assistant surgeon Thomas Ledwood all died in Batavia or on their way home. Bligh was later exonerated during the court-martial inquiry and would then become master and commander of the HMS Providence and eventually the governor of New South Wales, Australia. Meanwhile, over that 2-month period, the mutineers and their new labour force attempted to settle Tobai. For security, they built Fort George, a palisade-walled enclosure named Serili after the king they had deserted and stolen a boat from. The indigenous population of Tobai were opposed to the new colony, despite Christian's attempt to parley with them. There were multiple skirmishes with natives, ending in a battle that commenced with 66 islanders being killed. Christian knew his authority was slipping with the failure to cement a settlement on Tobai, and so called for a vote with the mutineers. Despite 8 men remaining loyal to Christian, the rest were unhappy with their current situation and wished to return to Tahiti, and so with that they made their way back to the island, with Christian knowing he could not stay there long after deposing his commander. Upon the Bounty's third arrival at Tahiti, they were met with hostility. Whilst they had been gone, a British ship had landed and unravelled the truth about Christian's fictitious settlement and the fact that Cook had been long dead. Shortly after this, 15 of the mutineers abandoned Christian and the Bounty, taking their chances on the island. Knowing his visit would not be tolerated for long, on the 22nd of September 1789, Christian coaxed a group of Tahitians, mostly women, aboard Bounty under the guise of a gathering. As the frivolities took place, Christian cut the anchor rope and the Bounty began to float out to sea once again. Coleman, the armourer and indentured loyalist, saw what was occurring and so jumped overboard, luckily making it to shore. Upon realising that 6 of his captives were old women, Christian set them ashore on the near island of Maori before heading back out to sea. The Bounty's crew now consisted of only 9 of the original mutineers, as well as 20 Tahitians, 14 of whom were women. With that, they set out in hopes to settle one of the thousands of tiny islands in the vast Pacific Ocean. While surveying the charts Bligh had left behind, Christian came across Pitcairn, an island that had been discovered by Europeans in 1767 and named after the midshipman of HMS Swallow who had first sighted it. The island had its longitude correctly recorded, but its latitude was off by 3 degrees, enough for Cook to fail to locate it on his voyages. After searching for months to locate this tiny slither of land in the largest ocean on the planet, eventually Christian sighted it, and considering its misplacement on Royal Navy maps, deemed it the perfect place to hide the Bounty, its mutinous crew, and their abducted Tahitians.